Ontario's auto industry is being dealt yet another blow, with General Motors officially ending production of one of its vehicles.
Ford government is not doing enough to protect jobs in Ontario. In just the last 2 weeks, thousands of auto workers have learned that they will soon be out of work as 2 plants shut down production of vehicles in the province.
They thought they could leave quietly, with one decision, one closed line, one phrase about corporate optimization. But the 1,400 Canadian workers who were laid off were only the first link in a chain of events that turned the familiar order of the North American auto industry into a battlefield. For decades, Canada remained a loyal partner, supplying parts, assembling cars, saving factories, and in 2009 even pulling Detroit corporations out of financial ruin by investing billions of taxpayer dollars. But when the plant in Ingleside closed its doors, General Motors management, however arrogantly it viewed its northern border, failed to notice the most important thing. Canada had changed. Today we will tell a story that many in the U.S. would prefer not to hear. It is the story of how one country, tired of playing the role of a silent performer, turned its own weapon against the world's largest car company, the market on which it had relied for decades. And while Washington hoped that Donald Trump's endless tariffs would break its competitors, the reality turned out to be much more painful. Under pressure from American protectionism, Canada forged a new economic strategy, precise and ruthless. Its first blows are already causing damage far beyond Ottawa. While American buyers wonder why popular SUVs have risen in price by a quarter, and dealers complain about empty lots, Canada is quietly forming what experts call the future of the North American automotive zone. At this moment, decisions are being made in the corridors of power that will determine where the next generation of electric vehicles will be built, who will control the supply chains of critical minerals, and who will dictate the rules in a market worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But the real intrigue is not that Canada has taken retaliatory measures. The real intrigue is how quickly the consequences of these measures began to undermine the very foundation of American industry that Washington was trying to strengthen. As it turned out, the closure of a single plant in Ontario led to a domino effect: delays in component deliveries to Michigan and Ohio, rising costs, falling stock prices, and the risk of electric van contracts being canceled. The plan was simple: reduce production in Canada and move capacity closer to home. But did General Motors have a plan in case Canada ceased to be a compliant partner? What if a country that had been perceived as a reliable manufacturing base for decades now sought complete industrial independence? And what does that mean for the American auto industry, built on the idea of mutual access and cheap Canadian components? In the next few minutes, you will hear why GM's decision may go down in economic history as one of the most underestimated strategic failures. You will learn why the Canadian government chose this particular moment to strike. Most importantly, we will analyze how this trade war will rewrite the rules of the game in North America, affect millions of jobs, and possibly mark the beginning of the end of Detroit's familiar dominance. The closure of the Ingersoll plant was not just another cutback, but a point of no return where the accumulated tension between Canadian industry and Detroit corporations burst out. General Motors announced the shutdown as a corporate adjustment, but behind this wording lay a profound strategic shift that management decided to keep quiet about. Against the backdrop of declining demand for electric vehicles, the company was indeed looking for ways to cut costs, but industry sources claimed that GM had been experimenting with reallocating production capacity to Mexico and the southern United States over the past 2 years. This was not formally announced publicly, but traders tracking component shipments noted unusual logistics movements that coincided with the first hint of job cuts in Ontario. For Canadian workers, the layoff of 1,400 employees was a blow. But even harder was the fact that the company did not offer any transition plan. Journalists who attended union meetings reported that even GM's regional managers learned of the closure just days before the official announcement. it looked not just like an economic decision, but like a demonstrative gesture. Canada was no longer a priority. This is precisely what those who remembered the company's rescue in 2009 at the expense of billions in public funds perceived as a betrayal. Melanie Joly, calling GM's actions abandoning the country, reflected not only a political position, but also the emotional state of a society that felt that a long-standing partnership had collapsed in an instant. And although the closure of the plant itself was a flashpoint, the consequences were exacerbated by additional details that added to the drama. According to insider leaks, some of the equipment from Cammy's was shipped out on night flights even before the official announcement. These reports were not confirmed, but photos of cargo platforms that appeared in the press added fuel to the fire. For the public, this became a symbol of the corporation taking away everything of value before explaining its motives. Even if there was no real evidence, the very fact that such details were being discussed reinforced the perception of betrayal. The Canadian government's reaction was a mirror image of the accumulated irritation. Ottawa decided that the era of quiet requests was over. The decision to reduce tariff quotas on car imports for GM and Stellantis was one of the toughest steps taken in recent decades. Formally, the measure was justified by the decline in local production, but unofficially, government sources said it was a demonstration of the invest in manufacturing or pay principle. For the first time, Canada linked access to its market directly to the level of industrial presence. Some elements of Ottawa's response were targeted attacks. For example, one of the analytical documents leaked to the press considered the idea of introducing additional checks on the origin of electronics in imported cars. This would have created significant delays at the border, although officially the discussion was limited to theory. Even if this measure was not ultimately implemented, the very fact that it was considered showed how serious the government was. Moreover, there were rumors in Canadian financial circles that as early as the summer, Canada had quietly assessed the possibility of redirecting subsidies for electrification to South Korean manufacturers who are actively looking for sites to expand. This was not a direct threat to GM, but a signal. The Canadian government is ready to look for new strategic partners if the old ones fail to fulfill their obligations. Such a move is in line with the general trend, where Canada is seeking to cease being a branch of the American auto industry. When the Ministry of Finance announced the reduction in quotas, Detroit initially considered it a political maneuver that could be waited out. But it soon became clear that the measures affected not only the supply of finished cars, but also components that crossed the border dozens of times during the manufacturing process. Automated supply chains built up over years were suddenly faced with unpredictable costs. Dealers in Michigan began to complain that the wait for some models had increased by several weeks, and in some cases by months. There were reports that small batches of parts were turned back due to incorrect preferential quota documentation, although these incidents were officially explained as logistical disruptions. But the most painful aspect was the political subtext. Canada made it clear that it would no longer meekly accept decisions that destroy its industry. Whereas Ottawa had previously limited itself to protest notes, it was now ready to use the tools that Washington had previously used. The new strategy was not chaotic. Like the American tariffs, on the contrary, it was designed to exert long-term pressure. The Canadian government understood that companies like GM cannot quickly restructure their logistics, and that every day of delay, every lost contract, gradually changes the balance of power. Thus, the first 2 points of the story show that the conflict between Canada and General Motors became more than a dispute over the closure of a plant. It was the beginning of a large-scale redistribution of power within the North American auto industry, where Canada decided for the first time in many years to dictate the terms itself, rather than wait for decisions to come from Detroit or Washington. Canada's reaction to General Motors' departure was not just an emotional outburst, but part of a deep, premeditated strategy that had been maturing behind the scenes in Ottawa for several years. Starting in 2018, when Donald Trump's tariffs dealt the first serious blow to the metallurgical and automotive industries, the Canadian government began to rethink its role in the North American economy. At first, these were cautious steps: more investment in research centers, preferences for local suppliers, localization of supply chains. But after the GM story, it became clear that there was no time to waste. It was at this moment that the so-called Buy Canadian approach was born, a new economic doctrine based on the principles of industrial sovereignty and national priority. The key moment came with the new government's first budget, presented in early November. It set out a very strict focus. Only companies that create jobs within the country will receive support. Support in the broad sense, from tax breaks to access to infrastructure and energy resources. The largest industries, steel, aluminum, automotive, and battery manufacturing, were singled out as a separate priority. The total amount of investment distributed through the Strategic Response Fund was almost $200 million, with some of these funds being directed specifically to those regions where the consequences of GM's departure were particularly acute. However, this budget was only the tip of the iceberg. Behind the scenes, Ottawa was preparing new economic instruments that, taken together, were intended not only to compensate for losses, but also to change the very structure of industrial dependence on the United States. One such instrument was conditional licensing for cross-border trade in components, whereby large manufacturers had to confirm local employment levels and purchases from Canadian suppliers. At first glance, this looked like a bureaucratic formality, but for those who had built business models on unconditional logistics between Ontario and Michigan, these changes became a headache. At the same time, Canada stepped up its efforts to attract new investors from Asia and Europe. The government held talks with 3 major battery manufacturers from South Korea and 2 car companies from Germany. Officially, they were offered sites vacated after GM and Stellantis wound down their operations. There were reports in the press about exclusive conditions being offered to companies willing to fully localize production, including lithium and cobalt processing. This was a signal. Space in the Canadian industrial ecosystem is limited, and whoever gets there first will reap the key benefits. Against this backdrop, the American strategy, based on protectionism and tariff threats, began to look less like the protection of interests and more like a provocation, opening the way for Canada to pursue its own industrial geopolitics. And while Washington hoped that Canada would remain a silent partner, as before, Ottawa's response demonstrated that it now acts symmetrically, but in a much more sophisticated manner. It does not impose tariffs on a one-size-fits-all basis, but builds a complex system of access to benefits, subsidies, and contracts, where every exception must be earned. This put psychological pressure on businesses. Suddenly, production plans began to depend not only on demand, but also on political loyalty to the country where production is located. And as ironic as it may sound, it was American tariff policy that gave Canada the leverage to take such action. When Donald Trump announced 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum in 2018, he called it freedom from unfair trade. However, a few years later, it became clear that American companies themselves were caught in a trap. Protectionism led to higher prices for metal and components, and now production chains have begun to falter. According to Canadian analysts, American car factories have underproduced about 20,000 cars per month over the last 2 quarters due to a shortage of components and rising prices. But the worst was yet to come. Increased tariffs imposed by the United States on imports from Asia forced GM and other corporations to cut back on purchases of cheap Chinese components. However, refusing Canadian supplies only exacerbated the problem. To make up for the shortfall, purchases had to be made from Europe, where logistics are more expensive and delivery times are longer. As a result, dealers in the Midwestern United States began receiving incomplete vehicles that required on-site modifications. This was not only a financial blow, but also a blow to GM's image. At a time when speed and flexibility in logistics had become the basis of competitiveness, GM looked archaic and clumsy. While the American auto industry was reeling from the consequences of its own decisions, Canada methodically used every misstep to strengthen its position.